I am very pleased to see so many people joining us today. I'm also pleased to see Menas Afridi with us, who had given us the first session. At Menas, if you are on, there you are, Menas. Why don't you give us a short welcome, a short greeting to those who met you 2 weeks ago?
Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing? I'm sorry, I just came from seminar, so I'm like always pressed with time, but it's so good to see everyone. And of course, Omar, who is a wonderful brother and great scholar. I was also at the Robert Satlow, so I hope to be there for David as well.
Thank
But
you so much, Menas.
this is a wonderful series, Bjorn.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for having all of us.
I think we have a number of students with us today, which is really wonderful. And so we definitely want to kind of give students a chance to learn something about that they may have never thought about today, about the situation in North Africa, the Jewish-Muslim relations in North Africa before, during, and after the Holocaust and World War II. And I hope that you will ask questions, either questions that you want us to go back to because you missed something, or just a question that is either broad or even more specific, depending on what you want to know. At the end of our conversation, we always have about 20 minutes of question and answer, and I and everyone else hopes you will participate. I'm Bjorn Krondorfer. I'm the director of the Martin Springer Institute here at Northern Arizona University. We are celebrating the 20th anniversary of our institute, which was founded by a Holocaust survivor, Doris Springer, or Doris Martin, maiden name and married name. And she survived in Poland, and she and her husband, once they moved to Flagstaff and became residents, decided to endow an institute that looks at the history and legacy of the Holocaust, but also at situations that need our attention today because of grave harm and injustice, and think about how we can move forward, how to reckon with the past, repair, and reconcile. I would like you to know, in case you just joined us, that we have one more part in that series, and that will not be on a Wednesday. It will actually be this coming Sunday on the 14th at 11 a.m. Arizona time. For those who are not in Arizona, that would be 1 p.m. East Coast time. That is early in the morning for us because it will be in the evening for David Mortadell, our next speaker. He's calling in from the United Kingdom. And he will speak about Islam, Nazi Germany, and World War II. So I hope many of you will join and rejoin us for the last session of the series on Sunday. I will introduce our guest speaker now, and then we will get started. But let me say just a few words about what to expect. We will not go beyond 75 minutes. Omar and I will have a conversation for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then we open up to your questions. You can put your questions on chat and we can read them, but even better, you actually have the courage to ask a question directly, so that we see who the person is who is asking the question, and Omar can interact with you directly and everyone else. That is a plan. Aomar Boum is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of California, Los Angeles. He attended universities in Marrakesh and Rabat in Morocco, as well as in Tucson, Arizona. His work focuses on His work focuses on Jewish-Muslim relations from the 19th century to the present. His ethnographic work engages religious and ethnic minorities, such as Jews, Baha'is, Shia Muslims, and Christians in post-independence Middle Eastern and North African countries. And he has written on Moroccan Jewish historiography, Islamic archives, Islamic education, Holocaust, antisemitism, and migration, and actually even more topics than the ones I just mentioned. He's a recipient of many grants and fellowships. He's also a member of the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He authored dozens, and I'm not exaggerating, he authored dozens of scholarly articles, book chapters, and encyclopedic entries. He is the author of Memories of Absence, How Muslims Remembered Jews in Morocco, and co-editor of the Holocaust and North Africa. His newest book from 2020 is called Historical Dictionary of the Arab Uprisings. So you can see he looks both at the past and the present, at the micro level human interactions and the macro level and meso levels of human interactions. And therefore, I think, Omar, you are the perfect person for us to help us understand what is happening in North Africa during World War II and during the Holocaust. Welcome, and I'm glad you're with us tonight.
Thank you, Bjorn. Thanks for the invitation. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to be as part of this group of Manas, David, and Robert. So I'm excited about the conversation.
I would like to start with maybe a more personal question about your background and also your journey that got you from Morocco to the United States, that helped you and motivated you to inquire and investigate Muslim-Jewish relations on so many different levels that your research shows us. You studied in Morocco, you studied in the United States, you're an anthropologist, you work ethnographically. Tell us a little bit about how you got there.
Okay.
And
so,
what got you here?
I am, by training, I would say I am a historical anthropologist. In a sense, I was very lucky to be educated at the University of Arizona in Tucson. It had at the time in early 2000, really one of the strongest Middle Eastern programs, arid lands programs, African studies programs, and anthropology programs. So I am a product of this multidisciplinary program that looks at all of these issues, that uses all these tools to understand society. So where I come from, I was born in Oasis in southeastern Morocco. And so I was raised in the desert, and that explains probably why I chose Tucson. So home where I grew up in, as far as my home, is really very, very similar to Tucson and to the environment of Tucson, except that the dates probably are, palm days and palm trees are probably different. But as far as my research, I was really interested in, when I came to the University of Arizona, I wanted to work on water issues and water management. And given the fact of where I grew up and my interest in arid lands and in these and desert environments, but as I was beginning to think about the issues from a theoretical as well as a practical level, I found out that a lot of the questions that I'm interested in have already been dealt with and asked and raised and answered by many of the scholars that I was mentored by. So I thought about changing the topic, and so I really came to the study of Jews through manuscripts that I had at this time, and they looked at the time. So Islamic manuscript, where the relationship between Jews and Muslims in desert environment in southeastern Morocco was really very, very dominant. So thinking about the question of Jews, how Jews fit in the anthropological and historical research I've been working on, there are, as many of you know, or as probably some of you know, there are, in the area where I grew up in southeastern Morocco, which is the anti-Atlas, right before you get into the desert, it has probably at the time had about 10,000 Jews before 1940, before World War II. And that's out of a population of 250,000 Jews all over Morocco. So, but historically speaking, in terms of research, very little has been done about these communities. So my approach was to look at write about these communities in southeastern Morocco, but what I call Saharan Jews and Saharan communities, and try to connect the work that has been done in Timbuktu about the Jews of Mali, who are originally also from, they go back to the Inquisition, to 1492, and they came to Mali via Fez and Marrakesh as merchants, and then they settled in that part of the desert, and then connect them to the coastal area, to Mogador and to other communities and Marrakesh. So what I saw as my job is to fill the gap between sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. And how to do it is, for me, a lot of the studies, as Mehnaz has done also, we see that a lot of the work that has been done in Jewish studies has been done generally by Jews, about Jews, and on Jews. So we thought that we can have a conversation. I personally thought we can have a conversation about Jewish-Muslim relations, but anchoring it in Muslims' views. So that's why I decided to shift the conversation by talking about how Muslims and the generations of Muslims, from the great-grandparents to the parents, Muslims who lived with Jews, who knew Jews, who interacted with Jews, and Muslims who've never met a Jew in this part of the desert, remember, think about, and construct Judaism. So that's basically the foundation of my work. It starts in a small oasis, looking at the very small population of Muslims, and then from there, I move to the bigger picture. So I start with the micro, and then I start thinking about macro questions, like questions of the Holocaust, which we can talk about later, questions of Jewish-Muslim relations in the context of the Moroccan state, questions of Jewish migration to Israel, and questions also of the Jewish diaspora, the Moroccan Jewish diaspora, not only in Israel, but also in Europe, in the Americas, as well as in Canada. So that's what I would say about myself. And I was also, just one other thing to mention is that I'm very lucky for two reasons. First of all, I was trained in an Islamic Arab tradition, okay? So, and then my training in a French educational system. So the linguistic part also helped me when I did my master's in Morocco, which is an English-speaking and English-teaching university. It prepared me to come to the United States here and think about these issues through three traditions. You have the Moroccan Arabist tradition, the French tradition, and the American tradition.
Thank you so much to get us started. Right away, I would like to take us out of the small oasis into the larger picture, so that people who haven't thought much about North Africa, or may not even have been aware that North Africa was part of World War II. I'm thinking not only of students who are attending today, but also other people, to help us a little bit understand of what is the situation in North Africa prior to World War II, in terms of the various European interests that play out really from Morocco all the way to Syria and Iraq, even leaving the North African continent. So we're talking about Franco's Spain, a fascist state. We're talking about Mussolini's Italy, another fascist state. We're talking about Hitler's Germany, yet another fascist state. And then Vichy France, the southern part of France, that kind of gets independent rule under Nazi occupation and adopts many anti-Semitic rules and regulations, which they implement in North Africa too. So now it's throughout a lot of terms and ideas that we need to kind of step by step maybe unfold and explain a little more, and maybe you can help us to do so.
That's a great question. So I think I still, for me to give a a view of this bigger picture, I would like, as this is my job as an anthropologist, I would like to start with this small unit. So in the place where I grew up, it's called Fumsgit, and about, I would say, less than half an hour, about an hour, 45 minutes from my village, there was a mine called Bouazer. That was a cobalt mine. That mine, by the late 1930s, by the beginning of the Vichy government, already had German representatives there. Okay, and that was a mine that was basically exploited by the Vichy authorities, but the German Nazi authorities were already interested in that. That's really far into the desert, and that actually one of the few German prisoners that were caught after the American landing were some of these German officers who were trying to see how to exploit the mines for future in case Hitler wins the war in North Africa. So that just shows you the complexity of this situation. Here, what you have is that in Morocco and Tunisia were under French authorities, Vichy authorities, as well as West Africa. If Libya was under the control of fascist Mussolini, Italy, and northern Morocco and southern Morocco were under the control of Spain, of Franco. But the Germans didn't have that direct control of North Africa or the colonies, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. So the bigger picture is that you have a population, you have a context, an occupation, colonial context. That where in this colonial context, you have the indigenous population, they're marginalized. As far as Jewish population, the Jews in Algeria before the war, they were French citizens under the Crimea Decree of 1870. Muslims generally, they were not seen as in Algeria, they were not seen as French citizens. In Morocco and in Tunisia, the Jewish population and the Moroccan Muslim population were subjects of the Sultan. So in terms of the categories, the citizenship and the categories were different all across the board. So that really, when we think about these issues of North Africa during the war or pre-war, we have to really think about context-based, either general or sometimes even smaller context-based. So I'll give you an example. For instance, in Algeria, you have Constantine and Orana. We can talk a lot about Constantine later when we talk about Jewish-Muslim relations, or at least some of the partnership that existed between Jews and Muslims. So every context had its own history. And because of the kind of relationship, social, economic, and political relationship that were built and nurtured between Jews and Muslims, and sometimes between Jews and Jews, sometimes between Muslims and Muslims. So, but by the beginning of the war, you totally have a different context. Here you have the Vichy authorities in Morocco and in Tunisia and in Algeria really introduce the anti-Jewish laws. And that would also change the context. So more and more Jews would lose not only their citizenship, especially in Algeria, but they would lose their property. So because we have an Aryanization of the economy, Jews will be expelled from as lawyers, and as a lot of them would lose their businesses. In some areas, Jews would be expelled from the neighborhood, what we call the Muslim quarters, the Mellah. In some other areas, no. So I'll give you an example of the South. In the South, some of the interviews I did with Muslims as well as Jews, very few Jews were aware actually that there was a war going on, at least until the American landing. Why? Because Nogues and the French could not disrupt those relationships, because they knew that if they disrupted the role of Jews in these local economies, the whole economy would fall, given the fact that Jews were intermediaries and peddlers and merchants. So it's in the north, under Spain, under Franco, you have actually there more collaboration between Muslims and the Nazis. And that's because of a history, as you know, and as a lot of people have written about, that's a history of nationalism. And even during the 1930s, there was a very nationalist push to free the North from Spain, and also to free the whole Morocco from French colonialism. So that actually led to actually more partnership, at least to some extent, between, or more contact, because the Germans had actually a lot of propaganda offices in the north, more in the north than in the French controlled area. So it's Tangier, which was an international city, has also its own dynamic. You have the Americans there, you have the British, you have all kind of different intelligence group, and that's why you can get that idea, the complexity of Tangier as a city, as an international city, from, if you look at the National Archives in DC, that also gives you a picture of how the whole, how each, just to sum up, how each context is different in this area, before the war and even during the war.
So before we return to Jewish Muslim relationships, just to clarify for everyone here tonight. So in the 1930s, we have Italy, Spain, and France, all fascist states, well, France not exactly, but who are colonial powers in North Africa. Germany is not present. The war in Europe starts in 1939. It extends to Russia in 1941. At what point do the Germans get involved militarily in North Africa? And at what point then come the British and Americans to fight against the Germans in North Africa? Help us a little bit with the timeline.
The Germans actually began sending their, from what I'm not talking from the perspective of interviews here, I'm talking from what the archives is saying. The Germans, you have actually German spies in North Africa as early as 38, sometimes even before that. So we have a very heavy presence by 38, 39, very small scaled interventions after 34, especially in Algeria. By now, the Germans are trying to push for more anti-Semitic discourses in Algeria, and then try to have a spillover in the rest of North Africa. The Spain, you have the, first of all, you have the civil war from 36 to 39, but then Franco, even though he got a lot of support from Mussolini and Hitler, didn't play a major role in, at least didn't intervene as much as the Germans wanted, despite his meeting with Hitler in Paris after the war. So the Americans would come in November, and they would enter the war, as we know, after with Pearl Harbor. So 42, November 42. So that's where you have the landing, the landing in Casablanca at the time was called, also there is a city called Fedala, which is called today Mohammedia, and then Safi, and then Algeria. So the landing in 42. So but that period between the occupation of Paris and then the formation of Vichy government and the American landing, Vichy was in control of most of Algeria, most of Tunisia and Morocco. The Germans had little direct, I would say, direct intervention, but they were consulting. There was a heavy presence of German authorities and officers. As I said, I just mentioned the example of the South, and then also in other cities like Rabat, in Casablanca, in some of them in the north, many of them also as we know in Tunisia. In Tunisia, Tunisia came under, it's the only country that came under German occupation, direct occupation, in from 42 to 43 for about 6 months, for about a 6 month period. And then the British, as far as the French, you have the Free Army that's separate from Vichy, that was also based, that was working with the British. And by the 42 or the beginning of 1942, you have the you have what we call the push for taking over the French territories in Africa by Colonel Leclerc, and as well as this is after they would the French Free Authorities would take over Syria and Lebanon. Then you start seeing a push in Africa through Chad and Gabon, and which will get even more intensive after the American landing. And then what you have the push to take over Libya and the push to take over Tunisia in 43. So this is just to give you a general historical, I would say, context as far as how things were. So North Africa, in a sense, was central to the war. It was central to the war in mainland Europe. So the American landing, what we call Operation Torch, was really an important step for the Americans to use. And most of it was, you have also to include here that not all of the war, you have the indigenous soldiers that were indigenous. So when I say indigenous soldiers, you have whole, as many of you know, we have the whole, what you call the French colonial army in Africa in general, was composed largely of what we different groups, indigenous group. We have the Gooms, you have the Senegalese tirailleurs, and all of these groups actually played a major role, not only in freeing or ending the Vichy government and the Italian presence and German presence in North Africa, but also later on in winning the war in mainland Europe.
Great, thank you. Once the Germans enter and expand the war into North Africa, what changes for Jews and Muslims? Are they affected the same way? What ways are they affected the same, and in what ways are they not affected the same? And maybe we can even focus that question just on Morocco and Algeria, because there are differences in these two states, rather than talk about Tunisia and Syria, to simplify just a little bit. So on the ground, what is the effect of the expansion of the war into those territories?
So let me step back a little bit and talk about 1940. The moment after June 1940, and then the implementation of the first anti-Jewish laws by the Vichy government in Algeria, in Morocco and Tunisia, and then the second one in 41, the Jews were already feeling the changes. Jews are losing their jobs in schools. You have a number of restricted numbers of how many Jews can go to schools, and Jews starting forced to sell their property. Okay, and then so you got all the what we call the anti-Jewish laws are already being implemented by 41, and then you start seeing actually a move of many Jews from Algeria to Morocco, hoping that the situation there will be less restrictive, given the fact that you have what's called here, this Jews are subject of the Sultan. So they have a different status. You can't apply the racial laws to Jews in Morocco because they are subject of the sultans. So race laws, so you have to apply the religious law, what we call the dhimmi law, the religious category here. So that's actually a distinctive difference between Morocco and at least Tunisia, and Algeria, where Jews were seen as citizens. They are part of the French citizens. As far as Tunisia, Tunisia would a lot of course, there is a similarity in the sense that you have more in the 6 months of occupation. You have an intensive approach by the Germans to basically affect the Jews of even taking local Jews to mainland Europe, to some of the camps to die. The Jews also, some of the Jews from North Africa, they were never I would say, as far as taking Jews from North Africa to the camps in Europe didn't happen, although with a few cases, but a lot of Jews who find themselves during the German occupation of France in Europe, and especially in France, many Jews from Morocco, from Tunisia and Algeria. Many Jews actually died in Auschwitz and other places. And also some Muslims too. So the number between 800 to 12,000, 800 to 1,200 Muslims. I'm not talking about Muslims from Albania and the Soviet Union. These are Muslims from Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, and some of them from Iraq, some of them from Syria and Lebanon, and some of them from Egypt also died in the Nazi camps. And that's I think that's where more research has to be done. And I think Mena's reference to that in her talk the first time. But definitely you have also the camps, and this is I think Rob mentioned that, but last time. But one of the things that happened also during this period, in that because Vichy, France, before Vichy, even going back to the 19th century, had this colonial project to link what we call the Mediterranean to sub-Saharan Africa, to Mali and Niger, and then connect it to Senegal via a railroad system. There was a huge debate in the 19th century and early 20th century about the feasibility of this project, whether it should happen or not. And then some people were pushing for, instead of railroads, pushing for roads, for having introducing the car and the buses and the trucks. So by 1940, because Vichy wanted actually to rebuild this pride that's lost because of the defeat and their defeat by the Nazis, so they wanted to build that pride. Part of it is a really nationalistic pride. So they started building a rebuilding this railroad system. And one of the reasons why it was actually accelerated is part of it has to do with the fact that they want actually to maximize the use of the mines that existed in the desert and the mines that existed in other in places throughout Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. The labor force, they could find a cheap labor force that was mostly composed of European refugees. And that's actually, I'm actually right now I just finished a comic history, or I wouldn't call it a graphic novel, but I call it a comic history of an experience of a German Jew who fled Munich to Berlin, and from Berlin ended up in France. Then he went to Spain. From Spain, during the war, he came back to France, and then he ended up in Algeria. And then it was picked up by the French authorities and was where he worked in two mines, in a detention mine, penal mine, and in a labor mine. In two camps, in a detention camp and in a labor camp. Just to give you exactly a summary, so I want public readers and also university students to have an idea about, use the comic as a way to tell the history. And because there's only one comic book that actually talk about the story of North African Jews in their relationship to Europe during the World War II. And it was actually an iteration of the experience of Gez, of the Tunisian boxer who died in Auschwitz. But instead of writing about the boxer, the author changed it to be about a soccer player. So I'm trying to actually use the Holocaust Museum collections, and I read all the majority of the stories that are basically housed in the archives of the Holocaust Museum. And through that, I composed I wrote a composite narrative of one individual reflecting all these experiences of all of these refugees who ended up, including, fortunately, one of them is Freud's granddaughter, who spent about 6 months, or close to 6 months, in Casablanca. But she didn't have the same experience. She was lucky because she ended up leaving through Tangier, and from Tangier to Lisbon, and from Lisbon she came to the US. But a lot of the people actually had to suffer in these camps. Some of them died in the camps. So that's the story that also I'm interested in telling as an anthropologist. But instead of doing it through, and they wanted to use the comic to reflect the immediacy of the moment. So it's a way to write the Holocaust as an anthropologist using these panels in a detailed way that shows really the human experience of these refugees.
How, so I want to come back just for a moment. So it's clear that the lives of ordinary Muslims changed to some extent. The lives of ordinary Jews in North Africa changed to some extent. But if you can return just for a moment of some of the differences between the kind of the hardships that both groups experience, or the opportunities that might open up during this time for either one of these groups.
That's a great question. So that's a question about measuring to what extent people were affected. I think you have to go back to country by country, but also you have to think about it in terms of time and period. So if you look at the 1930s, and this is actually one of the greatest moments of Jewish-Muslim relations in North Africa. So you have the LICA, which is the International League Against Anti-Semitism and Racism, that was founded in Paris by Bernard Lecache. It was really an ardent critic of the Nazis, going back to even before Hitler rose to power. And what Lecache was aware of, despite the push by some Jews from France not to be engaged in this critique of the Nazis, he realized that the Nazis were trying to really disrupt the relationship, the form, whatever kind, whether you call them cordial or good relationship, but there was some form of relationship between in Algeria, especially in Constantine, between Muslim leaders and Jewish leaders. And as by 1929, the event of Jerusalem in 1929, he realized that the Germans were, at least the Nazis, were trying to use these events to create a division between Muslims. And what a better place was in Algeria because of the colons who were also anti-Semite in many ways. So Bernard Lecache realized that one way to fight against this move is to really try to build partnerships with Muslims. And he succeeded in many ways. He actually ended up going to Tunisia and Morocco and Algeria. He met with Ibn Badis. These are major leaders, key figures, Muslim figures. And the idea is he realized that one way to create this alliance is to fight for Muslim interests also, to make sure that Muslims gain citizenship, to make sure that Muslims get jobs in the same way Jews are getting jobs, and all of these things. So he saw it as a spiritual partnership that's built around an economic support, an economic partnership. But by 1939, the project ended. So that's because of so Bernard Lecache had to flee after the Nazis' occupation of Paris, and he was actually interned in one of the camps. He was lucky because he survived it, and he became actually a major, a key witness in many cases against French authorities in Algeria. Now, to what extent Muslims, Jews, were also affected, I think you have also to factor in here, there was a drought. Okay, so 1929 economic crisis that affected not only the United States, but also it was a global crisis. There was also a drought in the region. There was a locust also invasion that actually killed a lot of, and there was a famine. My father, I did a lot of interviews with my father, God bless his soul, who is now in his 120 to 112 years old. And one of the things, even now he's going through dementia now, but the only thing he remembers is the 1930s and 40s. So that's the only, so he talks mostly about this period, and it's all about drought, it's all about famine, it's all about really locust. And so you have the war, but you have also a lot of environmental disaster that's going on. And then you have also pandemics, not as similar to the pandemics we're living right now, but the 1940s, there was a pandemic. they have their own local names for it. So, but I do believe, and I think people were affected economically in the same way, I would say, but I do believe that a lot of Jews, because of the anti-Jewish laws that were specifically introduced to affect the lives of Jews, I do believe a lot of Jews were affected by losing their property, but also some Jews actually survived this. I'll give you an example. So for instance, one of the reasons why Freud's granddaughter and her mother were able to survive, because they were protected by a North Africa, a Sephardic Moroccan Jewish family, and actually they were allowed to live there in their homes and survive the war and survive that. So it depends on, you would say the same thing, I think, even in Tunisia. You have many cases where some Jews were actually able to live in Tunis, even though, despite even the German occupation. But that's not, those are few cases. I would say the majority of Jewish families really lost their citizenship, lost their property. Some of them have to go back to the Jewish, I wouldn't call it the Jewish Mellah or the Hara, the Jewish neighborhood, after living for years in the new urban sector of many cities. That's how I would say it. I don't think you can measure. I can't put a percentage of who was affected to what, but I think I would say that a lot of Algerian Jews actually were affected because of the power of the colons, of the settlers who controlled the urban city hall, politics of city hall, who were able to actually to expel a lot of these of Jews from their own jobs.
When I teach the Holocaust, like an introduction, and we introduce the idea and the concept of anti-Semitism, I often get asked by my students, so does this mean like it's against all people who are considered Semitic, and kind of implying that that Semitic, the outdated classification of Semitic races or ethnic groups would be Arabs and Jews. And so anti-Semitism is then misunderstood as a policy against Muslims and Jews simultaneously. And so I think you answered the question already, that by phrasing it as anti-Jewish laws. So the anti-Semitic laws that the Nazis implement in some of the countries in North Africa are really against Jews as racial laws and not against Muslims. That would be correct, right?
No, that would be, I would say Vichy, not the Nazi. So the Vichy, a lot of these laws that the Vichy introduced, you're right, these are mostly against Jews, and sometimes they try to encourage Muslims to basically use cases like, I say, the 1929 Jerusalem uprising or riot or whatever you want to call it, to basically push for more hatred toward Jews, because it was really built around, because especially I would say in Algeria, and later on I would say in Morocco, the French army was very, very, very anti-Semitic. Remember, we're talking about the Dreyfus affair. The Dreyfus affair was just a recent it did affect also the army in Algeria. This is the same army that later on would play a major role in the occupation of Morocco, or was also connected to Tunisia. So this was very connected. What was happening in the metropole was totally connected to these satellite colonies, and especially the 3 departments in French Algeria.
I'd like to complicate it just a little more for our audience, and hopefully you can clarify this for us. How is the situation different for Jewish people in North Africa who were mostly European refugees who've tried to find some refuge in North African countries, or were sent there or tried to escape? And they're often what we call Ashkenazi Jews, as opposed to the Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews, meaning those who have lived in North African countries for centuries. was the difference of what happened in World War II in North Africa for these two groups?
The lucky ones, there is a reason why Casablanca is the movie, everybody. So the lucky ones who have the means and were lucky also had the chance to leave from Casablanca to Lisbon, and from Lisbon to the Americas. The non-lucky ones were picked up and then sent to some of these camps. And we're talking about labor camps, talking about detention camps, and also thinking about camps that were just where people are sent as refugees, stayed there. And then you have many who were housed and who were able to find refuge with Jewish families. And to the extent that actually a lot of them ended up marrying some of these from within these Jewish families and came to the United States. So if you look, for instance, in LA here, what I've done some research about the Moroccan Jewish community here. One of the early migrants who came from Morocco as Jews to the United States were people who worked with the American army, and some of them are actually married some of these refugees too. So it's a the story is a very complex story. Depends on individuals. The ones actually who were sent to the camp, they were also, you got different variety of stories. They were still able to have access to letters through Jewish organizations, through the Quakers, through the Red Cross, and so many other associations. And actually, there is a book that's coming out soon by historian Susan Miller, talking about some of these stories. And the book is mostly about Ellen Benatar, one of these lawyers from Tangier, Moroccan law, who played a really key role in supporting many of these refugees. And her story is really interesting because of her complicated. Here she is, a lawyer who comes from Tangier. She's supposed to have lost her job, but still she was working with what we call the residency to help alleviate the pains and the struggles, financial struggles and family loss or family connections with these refugees who are working in the camps. So that's actually one of the, and we're very lucky to have these records at the United Holocaust Memorial Museum and other archives in Israel. So that actually help us understand and make sense of these stories. But what's missing, which I want more research to be done. I think we have to give more space to the West African story, to the Senegalese, to West African indigenous population in this story. And I think the museum is doing a really good job in terms of allowing indigenous scholars and from universities in Senegal, in Ghana, and in other places across West Africa to tell these stories, because I think that's another important story, especially given what happened to many of these Senegalese soldiers, some of the first ones who were actually shot and killed by the Nazi authorities after the occupation of Paris. And that would basically, because part of the Nazi ideology is to remember what happened in World War I, because these are the soldiers who helped France win the war against Germany in World War I. So part of the ideology, unfortunately, even the Wilmer Institute, the Anthropology Institute in Berlin, played a major role actually in fostering some of this discourse, racial discourse. So I think it's important to tell also that story. And I think that's where we haven't done yet a good job, but we are starting. We're starting to really connect all these dots and narrow these relations, because as we do this, we get a better understanding of what are these race laws about, what is how we ended up things the way it ended up, and how basically indigenous Muslims and Jewish and non-Jewish populations were affected by the war.
Now I'd like to return to storytelling. And that is part of the skill of an ethnographer, to listen to stories, to get stories out of the memory of people. And I wonder whether you have a few stories you can share with us in terms of how Muslims today, or 10 years ago, but sometime post-war, remember the relationship to their Jewish neighbors in their stories, and what those who stayed as Jews in Morocco, what they say about this time. Do you have some examples you can share with us?
Yeah. One of the, and I'll say something about Morocco because it's the place I'm really familiar with. I think I'm talking about the Moroccan government. The Moroccan government is very lucky as a government to have, yes, there is, I don't deny the fact that there is some anti-Jewish discourse among certain circles in Moroccan society. Some discourse that can be labeled even anti-Semitic. But I think Moroccan government is lucky because in the base of society, you still have people who remember the relations that existed between Jews and Muslims. And so when you go to a really faraway region, and you still have the most of the stories that I wrote about in my book and my articles are stories told by Muslims, and these are Muslims who still have mezuzahs in their homes, pictures of Jews when they left in '62, or Muslims who still make sure that not a single rock. You have these communities that use rocks to build their homes, but not a single rock is picked from a Jewish cemetery. Not to say that you have some graffitis sometimes on walls. There is, but and I think those are the stories that give me hope as an educator. And I think these are the stories we should tell. And from what I think this part of the work that Meraz is doing, is that these are the stories we need to tell. We need to tell positive stories. I think, unfortunately, we tend to focus more and more on negative stories because that's what drives the news. But there's so many stories where people have been taking care of cemeteries without getting a single cent or dollar or time for it. And that's what I mean by the Moroccan government is lucky, because there is an understanding and a foundational understanding that Judaism and Islam are tied together in a Moroccan society. They're tied together because they are relational. It's because they are relational religions. The people understand when the Shabbat starts, when the Shabbat ends, but then the next morning, when the Shabbat ends, they meet in the streets, they meet in the market, and that's historically it had for centuries and centuries and centuries. And I think there is the Middle Eastern conflict. There is a Middle Eastern conflict, but I think with still that Middle Eastern conflict, people can make the difference. They can still talk about both without limiting or erasing those historical relationships. And that's why I think even in the absence of Jews today, I would say some relative absence we have less than 2,000 Jews in Morocco today out of 250,000 Jews before the 1948. And in Israel now we have out of 7 or 7.5 million Israelis, we have over 1 million of them are Moroccan Jews. So Morocco's loss is Israel's gain in terms of this population, but still there is that relationship that still continue to exist, and it's about the understanding around religion first. And I can give you so many examples. Mimuna, for instance, when the Passover, this is a festival that ends after the Passover, the end of the leavened bread. Jews don't eat anything sweet or bread before they don't eat their own food. They have to eat the stuff that the Muslims cook for them and they bring. So that's how that's just shows those, what I call, it's about relations. And I think that's what struck me, and it continues. And that's why I think every time when I come, even here in LA, you have people who haven't been to Morocco for 40 years, 45 years. They still speak Moroccan Darija. They still practice their own Judaism in the traditional Moroccan, in the rituals in the synagogue that their ancestors have educated them to be in Fez and Marrakesh and other cities, and even in the Mizouza, in the Khzina, in the what we call the Gniza, when to store for storage of the books that you can't burn, you can't throw away, it's still done in the Moroccan way, even in a city and as urban, as modern, as greater as LA. And that's really speaks something about the land, how they see the land, how they see the space, how they see and that's, I think, I'm speaking here mostly, as I said, about Moroccan Judaism. I can't, at least because that's where I did a lot of the interviews and the stories. And it gives us hope. And that hope, we have to transfer it to the school. We have to transfer it to the classroom. And I think that's where the job of ministries of education in Morocco, that's the thing that they have to focus on, because in that absence, you have to fill it with the textbook. And I think that's what I love about what Ahnaz is also pushing for, and at least trying to educate. And it has to be on both sides. The education has to be done on both sides. You learn about the Jewish story, you learn about Muslim story, because that's how you maintain an equilibrium, I think, and you keep people engaged.
You mentioned cemeteries, and we actually have already a question here on the chat by Mike, who asked, can you say something about the large Jewish cemetery in Marrakesh, its origin and fate during the war, and the significance of a homogeneous white appearance?
So the Jewish, I don't understand, what do you mean by the
homogeneous white appearance? I do not know. I'm just reading the question.
So let me say Marrakesh is, if you go to that cemetery, which is actually right outside of the Mellah, it's also very close to the palace. That also shows the connection between the idea of protection, and which is also embedded in Moroccan law, but also in Islamic law. The cemetery I don't think it's as old as the one in Fez. I would say the cemetery of Fez is the oldest one, but there are two things. I don't understand exactly what I'm supposed to, the question. So if whoever is asking the question, if he would give me more,
Mike, do you want to clarify your question directly?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Oh, good. Yes, the cemetery is homogeneously white. Everything is covered in white.
Yeah.
It's unique.
You see that also, Mike. You see the same thing also in Fez too. But you have the what we call you don't have the big block that, but only in one section, because that shows you how old it is. That's the way they used to bury the burials in the early period. But if you look at a different section of the cemetery now, it's really changing. It's becoming, it's as if you are in other Ashkenazi cemetery, where you have more of the ornament, the names, and so on and so forth. So, and then so instead of, but there are also, but it's not as also old as the ones in the south, in a place called, for instance, Ufran in the south, which is one of the oldest cemeteries that goes back to the destruction of the first temple. Between the destruction of the first temple and the second temple, you have some of these cemeteries is just piles of rocks. Too bad I should have used some of the pictures, but but I still have some images of some of these cemeteries where, and they're really still protected.
We have another question that asks how the remaining Jewish population in Morocco is commemorating the Holocaust today. Do they use the Yom HaShoah? Do they have specific local dates that are different? Do you know anything about the commemoration of the Holocaust among Moroccan Jews today?
Most of the commemoration of the Holocaust of the Vichy laws in the region really revolves around their what they call as their appreciation and thanks to the Sultan, to the king. So the whole discourse really revolves around what the Sultan did to protect Moroccan Jews. This is an embedded theme in the perception of Moroccan Jews globally. So even though, because remember, it's a protectorate. Morocco was a protectorate under Vichy. Generally, the Sultan didn't have that much power because it was but still, for any law to pass, it has to have the seal of the Sultan. So even though the Sultan, they have the seal that the anti-Jewish laws were signed, but for Moroccan Jews, they believe 100% that, at least I would say the majority, they believe that the Sultan protected them, and they're using vignettes of, for instance, when after the signing of the laws and the implementation, the king had the rabbis and leaders of the community to come to the throne, and they sat close to him, not far from Nogues. And then you have also the Sultan did not go to the Fez when the French authorities came to Fez in the aftermath of the implementation of the laws. So there are a lot of the stories that they use to argue that, and that's why you have a push. This is something that they have been pushing Moroccan Jews to recognize the king as righteous among the nations. And but given the difference, there are the approach of different organizations, how that happens. I think this is where the difference between the community and other institutions is. But historically, this has been really, since I would say going back to even the 1980s, this has been one of the key questions that Moroccan Jews, or key, I would say, concerns of Moroccan Jews when it comes to celebrating the role of the monarchy in their protection. So that's I think the main way that the Jews actually celebrate this. But there are stories, of course, there are poems that were written, the Haggadah, written right after there is a Moroccan Haggadah actually produced by a hairdresser who wrote it in Rabat, very popular, and they wrote it to be basically recited by American Jews and American soldiers after the American landing in '43. It's a very popular. I can send you actually. The text actually is available online in Judeo-Arabic. It's a beautiful story that tells the story of the war from 39 to the end of the war. And there are also stories and poems that were written by Moroccan Jews in 38 and 34. Moroccan Jews, Algerian Jews, Moroccan and Tunisian Jews in particular, cautioning about the rise of the Nazis, which is really powerful, because here you have one of them is written in 34 and one is written in 38, really telling the story of what could happen to Jews if Hitler manages to not only control Germany and Europe, but also control North Africa.
I wonder, Karima, if you can ask the question directly to our speaker. So Karima is asking about Djerba,
Okay.
The Tunisian island that is sacred to multiple religions, question mark. Al-Qaeda found the existence of interreligious tolerance so threatening that the synagogue was bombed. So I guess it's just I guess Karima just would like you to comment on, or if you have any insights to this particular part.
So Djerba, for me, is one of the unique places in terms of when it comes to Tunisian Judaism, but also North African Judaism. I think it's a representation of how Judaism is anchored in the soil of North Africa, and the what we call the rituals or the hilulat of the Djerba, which is also very similar to other hilulat and celebration of shrines across North Africa, is just one example. Yes, and Al-Qaeda of the Arab Maghreb and other Islamic groups and terrorists have attacked some of that shrine, but I don't think. I think it's early 2000. In the early 2000s, I remember that, but it did not. I think impede or Tunisian Jews to go to, as part of the religious tourism, to go to the site on a yearly basis, because one of the things we have to understand is that shrines and the celebration of shrine, the holy man, a tzaddik, what's called the tzaddik, is a very, very, very central element of North African Judaism, especially of Tunisia and Morocco. So that's why when you go to the cemeteries of life or houses of life, the cemetery or house of life, and then within every cemetery you find a shrine of a holy man, and that's a part of a really an important part of religious practice, a Jewish practice in North Africa, to the extent that some of these shrines were actually rebuilt in Israel, in Ashkelon, in Ashdod. Some of these you have examples of similar shrines rebuilt, like Abu Hsira, Abu Hsira shrine, which is not far from Ashdod, and that's why I think Djerba is important. But if you are asking the question about the attack against some of the Jewish tourists and Jewish, it's part of the ideology of a few groups, and some of them manages to, unfortunately, in some, including in Morocco, some of these extremist groups, sometimes they killed some of, but I think it did not. It's not a. I wouldn't call it a common practice, because there is still, as I said, not only government but also families and communities themselves are doing their best to receive these communities as back to their homes and to protect their religious sites and houses of life.
Thank you.
Omar, we're getting fairly close to the end, but I just want to make sure that everyone understood that the numbers that you have mentioned about Moroccan Jews, that there were 250,000 Moroccan Jews before the 1940s, and now there are 2,500 left.
No, yeah, 2,500, yeah.
And so I don't want people to walk away that most of them perished in the Holocaust or World War II, but most of them emigrated to Israel. Can you just briefly point a few things of why so many emigrated after 1945? Or starting in 1945.
We should have another day here.
I know. Just give us a sentence or so.
Let me summarize. So let me give you the landscape. So you have about 250,000 Jews. Some people put the number at 270,000, but I'm very conservative. I put the number usually at 250,000. This is before 48. You have in Algeria about 140, in Tunisia around 80,000 to 100,000, and then in Libya between 40,000 and 60,000. Okay, so that's the number. The majority of them, of Moroccan Jews, unlike the Algerian Jews, who the majority of them ended up in France, the majority of Moroccan Jews ended up in Israel. And there is the migration, some of the migration is earlier than the 30s. Most of the migration came in the 50s. Some of it was unofficial, what we call underground migration, to the extent that in the 1950s, there were more Ashkenazi, Sephardic Jews or Jews from North Africa than Ashkenazi Jews. I would say more than 53%. But then by 1962, the majority were allowed to go after the Israeli government struck a deal with the Moroccan government, and then they were allowed to migrate if they wanted to migrate. This doesn't mean that all of them left. Actually, some of them stayed even after the Six Days Wars, after 67. But then by the 70s, a lot of the people started to leave. So you get from 250,000 by the 70s, you're less than 80,000. And the number continued to decrease as the king, and this is what Hassan II did. I think it was one of his argument is that when a Jew leaves Morocco, the country loses a citizen, but it gains an ambassador. So that policy allowed Moroccan Jews to never cut their relationship with Morocco. So you might have a 2,500 Jews in Morocco today, mostly in Casablanca, but at certain moments of the year, even with the unofficial relationship that existed between Morocco, even in the 80s and 90s, sometimes you get close to 100,000 Jews in Morocco come in as visitors because they come to see their cemeteries, and then also to celebrate the holy tzaddik. And I think that's why. So as far as how many people died, North African Jews died in the Holocaust, as I said, most of them were people caught in Europe, and the number I would say less than 2,000, less than that. If you could look at the whole region from Algeria to the people in Libya, most of the Jews who actually end up in the camps in Italy were actually British, happened to be British citizens who were in Libya at the time.
Omar, thank you so much. I know we could continue for probably another hour. If I didn't even get to my questions that we wanted to get through them, but what you contribute and the context that you show us and the stories you can tell, they're so rich and so varied, and we could definitely continue the conversation. But for today, we have come to an end. So one day we have to actually get you to NAU in person, and you introduce the comic graphic novel that you're writing to our students. I think that would be fantastic to kind of use a different medium to tell this story to us.